The grand dining room was glowing under warm golden lights, but the atmosphere felt strangely cold. Crystal glasses sparkled, expensive plates were neatly arranged, and a long polished table stood at the center of the room like a symbol of power and legacy. This was not just another family dinner. It was a gathering held out of tradition, obligation, and appearances. Every seat was filled with people who shared a surname, yet very few shared genuine affection. At the far end of the table sat Margaret Halley, an elderly woman in her late 60s. Her posture was calm, her hands gently folded in her lap, and her expression carried the quiet dignity of someone who had endured much in life. She wore a simple pastel shawl and modest jewelry, nothing flashy, nothing meant to draw attention. Yet there was a strength in her silence that few noticed. Across from her sat Vanessa, a younger woman dressed in a bold red dress, her confidence loud and unapologetic. Vanessa's smile was sharp, calculated, and constantly searching for approval. She was not officially part of the family, but everyone knew why she was there. She was the longtime companion of Margaret's husband, Richard Hull, a powerful businessman whose wealth and influence had shaped the family's fortune. Richard sat beside Vanessa, avoiding Margaret's eyes. The dinner began politely. Conversations floated around investments, properties, and social events. Laughter appeared on the surface, but beneath it ran an uncomfortable tension. Margaret listened quietly, occasionally sipping her water, never interrupting. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes stronger than words. Vanessa, however, had no intention of staying quiet. "So, Margaret," Vanessa said suddenly, her voice sweet but edged with mockery, "you must find these dinners exhausting at your age." The table fell silent. Margaret slowly looked up, her eyes calm. "Not at all," she replied softly. "I enjoy seeing family together." Vanessa smiled wider. "Family," she repeated, glancing around the table. "That's an interesting word. Times change, don't they? People move on. Life doesn't stay frozen forever." Some family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others pretended to focus on their plates. Margaret said nothing. Encouraged by the lack of resistance, Vanessa continued. "I mean, Richard deserves happiness. Someone energetic. Someone who understands the modern world." She laughed lightly. "Not someone stuck in the past." Richard cleared his throat but said nothing. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around her napkin, but her voice remained steady. "Happiness," she said gently, "is not always loud." Vanessa rolled her eyes. "That's such an old-fashioned way of thinking." The humiliation was subtle, but deliberate. Each word was designed to remind Margaret that she had been replaced, not just emotionally, but socially. One of the younger relatives tried to change the subject, but Vanessa wasn't finished. "You know," Vanessa said, leaning closer, "sometimes holding on too long only makes things harder for everyone. Don't you think?" Margaret met her gaze for the first time directly. Her eyes were not angry. They were tired but wise. "Let me tell you something," Margaret said quietly. "A tree that stands for decades does not envy the flower that blooms for a season." Vanessa laughed, dismissing the comment. The dinner eventually ended, but the damage was done. Margaret excused herself early, walking slowly down the hallway, her footsteps echoing softly. No one followed her. No one defended her. That night, alone in her room, Margaret sat by the window and looked out at the estate she had helped build from nothing. Memories flooded her mind, years of sacrifice, late nights, silent struggles, and unwavering loyalty. She remembered when Richard had nothing but an idea and a dream. She had stood beside him when success was uncertain and failure was common. What no one at that dinner knew was that Margaret had made a decision long ago. And soon, everyone would understand. Weeks later, the call came unexpectedly. Richard Halley had passed away peacefully in his sleep. Shock spread through the family. Arrangements were made quickly. Sympathy poured in. Vanessa was seen crying in public, holding Richard's photograph. playing the role of the grieving partner flawlessly. Margaret remained quiet. A week after the funeral, the family gathered again, this time in a formal office, where the reading of the will would take place. The same people sat together, but the energy was very different. Anticipation filled the air. Vanessa sat confidently, already imagining her future. She whispered to one of the relatives, "Richard promised to take care of me." Margaret sat at the end of the room, hands folded, expression unreadable. The lawyer entered and cleared his throat. "Richard Harley left a detailed will," he began, "and specific instructions that it be read in full." Vanessa straightened. The lawyer began listing assets, business shares, properties, accounts. Names were mentioned, amounts assigned. Vanessa smiled as she heard the words, "To be decided later." Then the lawyer paused. "There is a final section," he said, "written personally by Mr. Harley." He looked toward Margaret. Vanessa frowned. The lawyer continued, "To my wife, Margaret Harley, I leave full ownership of the family estate, controlling interest in all companies, and final authority over all trusts." Gasps filled the room. Vanessa's smile vanished. The lawyer went on. "Additionally, Mrs. Harley has been named the sole executor of this will." Vanessa stood up. "That's impossible," she said sharply. "Richard told me." The lawyer raised a hand. "The will is legally binding." He turned another page. "To those who believed loyalty was optional," the lawyer read, "remember that foundations matter more than appearances." Silence. Vanessa's face turned pale. Margaret slowly stood up. Her voice was calm but firm. "I stayed silent not because I was weak," she said, "but because I trusted time to speak for me." She looked at Vanessa not with anger, but with pity. "Respect is not demanded," Margaret continued. "It is earned." Vanessa left the room in disbelief. Her confidence shattered. Margaret remained. For the first time in years, she was no longer invisible. The room did not empty immediately after Vanessa stormed out. Instead, people remained frozen in their seats, unsure of what to say or even where to look. Because moments earlier, many of them had silently agreed with Vanessa's disrespect toward Margaret, even if they never dared to voice it aloud. And now the sudden shift in power left them disoriented and exposed. Margaret herself did not rush to leave or show any sign of triumph. She simply returned to her chair and sat calmly, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, while the lawyer quietly gathered his papers, offered her a respectful nod, and exited the room. One by one, relatives began standing up. Some offered awkward condolences, others forced polite smiles, and a few avoided Margaret entirely, but she accepted it all with quiet grace, responding neither with bitterness nor pride. Only Edward, Richard's younger brother, lingered behind. Distant yet observant, as always he finally broke the silence by softly saying that she must have known. And Margaret replied with gentle honesty that she had only suspected, explaining that she never defended herself because truth does not rush. Edward nodded slowly, as if understanding something deeper than the will itself. And when Margaret finally stepped outside into the late afternoon sunlight, she felt lighter for the first time in years, not because she had won, but because she no longer carried the weight of being misunderstood. In the days that followed, news traveled quickly through social and business circles alike, and people who had once ignored her now spoke her name with respect, sending invitations, calls, and requests for meetings, most of which Margaret quietly declined as she returned to the estate where she had once been humiliated, a place that felt different now, not because the walls had changed, but because she had. The staff treated her with renewed recognition rather than fear, and each morning she walked through the gardens she had planted herself years earlier, watching the trees that had grown slowly and steadily, just like her resilience. One afternoon, she invited the family back to the estate, not for confrontation, but for clarity, and when they arrived expecting tension, they instead found calm. As Margaret greeted each person personally and led them into the same dining room, the same table, and the same seats, yet with an entirely different atmosphere, she spoke without anger or accusation, explaining that the house was never meant to be divided by ego or entitlement, that her years of silence were not weakness, but belief in dignity over defense, and that while she would not punish anyone, boundaries would be set, privileges would change, and responsibility would replace assumption. The family listened quietly, some nodding, others uncomfortable, but none objecting, because Margaret was not seeking control. She was restoring balance. Weeks later, Vanessa returned unexpectedly, no longer wearing bold colors or confidence, but standing uncertain and restrained as Margaret allowed her inside, where Vanessa admitted she had been wrong, confessing that she once believed power meant being seen, chosen, and admired, not understanding what loyalty truly looked like. Margaret listened patiently and responded gently that attention was often mistaken for respect, reminding her that grace was strongest when undeserved but never unlimited. And as Vanessa left with quiet tears and sincere gratitude, Margaret felt no victory, only closure. Rather than isolating herself in wealth, Margaret stepped into a new purpose, attending meetings Richard once handled alone, asking thoughtful questions, listening carefully, and reshaping the family foundation from image-based charity into meaningful work centered on education, housing, and dignity, explaining simply that silence had served its purpose. Her reputation changed, no longer defined as Richard Hale's wife, but as Margaret Harley herself. And one evening when Edward visited again, and remarked that she had always been smarter than Richard, Margaret smiled faintly and said she never needed to prove it. When he asked why she never left, she explained that she believed in what they built, and that sometimes staying teaches more than leaving. And when he finally asked what came next, Margaret turned toward the window and answered with quiet certainty that now, at last, she chose herself.